I just had number 6 come out, so I do grow a little bit with each book, and that's kind of where my focus is. I'm trying not to compare to other people. I'm trying not to jump too far ahead. Slow and steady wins the race.
Create for No Reason is your weekly dose of inspiration to create what you believe should exist in the world. It's where passion meets craft, and we explore the joy of the creative process and building a meaningful body of work. I am so excited about this episode because we talk all things writing. I was joined by Jen Craven, who is a full-time author. She writes fiction books. And so we got into the creative process, how she comes up with her ideas, the writing process. It was really interesting for me because I am mostly a nonfiction reader, and to talk to an author who focuses only on story and fiction, it's really cool. It's interesting to hear how someone comes up with stories, how they take this big idea and then go from an idea to an actual story and then publish a book. And also fun to hear that the creative process is the same. I mean, that's what this show is about, right? Like, we talk to writers and artists and musicians and comedians and people creating work and putting it out into the world. And no matter how they're choosing to do that, whether it's writing books, podcasts, videos, the creative process is the creative process. The challenges we face are the same. And so we got into all that. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Jen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I can't wait to chit chat, and I'm so grateful to be here.
So we are recording this right after your book just came out.
Yes.
Your newest book just came out. Your 6th book just came out.
That's right. My latest book literally hit shelves yesterday as we're recording this. So I'm still riding that high of book launch and all the fun stuff that comes with a book release. So everything's, it's going great.
That's so amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
So you're in that like fun phase. I always think it's funny when writers say to me, authors are interesting because we want to have written the book. We don't always like to write the book.
Right. Yes. It's definitely a process. It's always a bit daunting to stare at like a blank screen whenever I'm starting a new project. I'm always sort of like, I don't even know what to do. I've done it before, but it's kind of like you have to start from square one again. And it's a lot to think about. Like, how are you going to all of a sudden start with nothing and end up with a book? But you do. It's just baby steps. It's one word after the next, and then everything, comes together.
Yeah, it can feel so daunting. Okay, but before we get into all of the writing process and how you come up with your stories, how you write your story, how you get that finished product done, why don't you share a little bit about you're a full-time writer. So share a little bit about who you are and what you write.
Yes. So I came to writing a little bit different than I think some people, in the sense that I have no background in, I didn't go to school to be a writer. I don't have a creative arts degree or anything like that. I was teaching higher ed for 11 years. And during that time, I dabbled into kind of like the mommy blogging space. And so I was doing a lot of personal essays and things along those lines. And that's really what started my love of, putting my words out there for more than just myself. And from there, it kind of, grew a little bit. And then the idea came, I wonder if I could really write a book. And I've always been a huge reader, always loved books and, been an avid reader. So I kind of combined those two things. And once I had written my first, it was like I got bit by a bug and was like, wow, I love this. This is totally what I would love to do, like for a living. And so 6 books later, here I am. I'm so happy to be able to be writing full time, and it's just a dream.
Who were your writing influences? I find it so interesting because I write nonfiction. I'm more of a nonfiction writer. So when I have kind of pushed myself, Jen, over the past probably like 4 or 5 years to read more fiction because there is so much beauty in fiction. Whereas earlier on in my career, I was like, no, it's a waste of time. I have to learn something and I need to be reading books that are like about productivity and business and just focus on that. And then when I started reading more fiction, I was like, oh, wow, you really learn a lot about the human condition and what people want. And so I'm curious how, like, who influenced you in the direction of fiction that got you to start to even want to write your first
Mhm,
book?
mhm. I think, first of all, that's so funny that you say that, explaining yourself as a reader, because I'm like the opposite. I'm always pushing myself to try to read more nonfiction because there's so much value to be gained there as well. And so I've challenged myself to try to read, because I read between 6 and 7 books a month usually, I try to make myself read a nonfiction book every month. So anyways, that's just like a little side note. It's funny, everyone's reading tastes are so different. But I guess I've always, like I said, I've always been a reader. I remember reading, as a kid, and I remember through middle school, high school, kind of having a book like stuck in, like hidden in my textbook. So no, like the teachers wouldn't know. And, in between in study hall, I wasn't the kid like messing around. I was the kid sitting there reading. So even those like middle grade, young adult sort of stuff was definitely popular, when I was in school. I loved the Harry Potter books, like when I was, a teen and early 20s, and that I got into that before everything got heavier and I was reading more adult sort of things. Some of my favorite authors starting out were definitely Jodi Picoult. I read all of hers, and now she's still like, an author that I definitely admire and all of that.
She's
But on
written
the
so many books, she's one of those that I look at, like,
yes.
she just churns books out. I don't even know how many she's
Oh
written.
my gosh. Yes, she has like dozens, and they're all, and I really do like her content because most of her books center on sort of like a ethical or moral dilemma, or so it has more, it's like the storyline, but then it's tied to like a bigger issue sort of thing. And so that's what a lot of my books do as well. So certainly not putting myself on par with Jodi Picoult by any means, but I
Do
think
it, Jen, do it.
in terms of style, or like the type of book or the content, I think like thematically, I could sit sort of with her in terms of like the type of book. If you're a reader that likes Jodi Picoult, then you would probably like my stuff as well.
Yeah, you have your tagline that says, "Stories where one decision can change everything."
Yes.
So talk about the stories that you think need to be out in the world, so you write them.
I'm really interested in moral dilemmas, or those split-second moments when you have to make a choice. And a lot of times it's like an impossible choice where there's consequences. And as humans, we are flawed. We don't always make the right choice. Doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means that you're human. And so I really like writing characters that are on that journey of something has happened, whether it was their fault or not, and then what are the ramifications, what's the fallout of that. So for instance, one of my books is a woman who is desperate to be a mom, but she cannot biologically carry her own children. She's gone through some failed adoptions, and she's just sort of desperate. And then all of a sudden a baby shows up on her doorstep, and it's this moral question of, oh my gosh, I know I should call the police, but I also really want to keep this baby. So it's, and again, what does she choose? And then the fallout after that. So just things like that. I'm really interested in those types of protagonists and exploring, choices and consequences.
Oh, okay. So when you're writing, when you come up with an idea, well, first of all, how do you come up with an idea? And what does that process look like for you? I mean, do you have the ending in mind? Do you build the character? Like, what is your process?
Usually most of my ideas start with that hook that's going to really grab the reader. It's like, and then the whole rest of the story evolves around that. So I had the idea for that story of like a baby showing up, and does the woman call the police or keep the baby? So that was just like that little kernel. And then it was sort of like expanding out broader. Okay, who is this character? What's her backstory? What has brought her to this point? Who are the people in her life? All of that kind of stuff. So it usually starts with that one kind of really juicy hook that I can then build the book out around. And yes, I am very much a plotter. So I have a full outline from start to finish before I even start writing the book. I know the entire story. I want to know where it's going, how it's going to end. That's just me personally. It keeps me on track and makes it feel more manageable, rather than sitting at a computer and just being like, oh, let's see where the book goes today. That to me is like way too scary. That makes me very anxious. And I know there's lots of writers that are like that. They're called pantsers. So they're like fly by the seat of your pants. And that is not me. I'm very type A.
I feel like I feel like I'm a mix of both because I will sometimes write down and just see where it goes. But every time I write down to see where it goes, it's so messy that I have to go back and plot anyway. So I might
Yeah.
as well just have plotted in the beginning. But then again, I sometimes think, well, that's just my process. So
Yes.
I'm gonna do this.
Yes. The pantsers will say, plotting too much takes away part of just like the freedom of writing and the creativity. That's, their sort of standpoint. And then the pantsers or the plotters will say, like, well, I want to be efficient with my time and I don't want to have to go back at the end and rewrite so much stuff that just was going nowhere, or you write yourself into a dead end or any sort of thing like that. So again, it's very much a subjective choice, and there's no right or wrong. I mean, there's absolutely no right or wrong. It's just a writer's style.
Are you part of any type of writing community where you're able to kind of have these conversations with people?
Yes, absolutely. I belong to the Women's Fiction Writers Association. I joined them back in, I think, 2020, and have gone to a few conferences and retreats and met so many authors, lots of great networking. So I highly recommend that organization for anyone who writes in that sort of women's fiction, book club fiction genre. And there's lots of subgenres, of course. So check them out. But even more sort of tight knit from that, I do have a writing collective of 8 authors, and we write across genre. We're from all walks of life. We're spread out across the US and Canada, and we are connected daily. We have an internal sort of chat where we're talking about our books or just personal lives or anything like that. But it's a great source of inspiration and also support, because the publishing industry is highs and lows. So we celebrate our successes and we can kind of support each other when there's rejections, which there's lots. And so that's been invaluable. Like, I would not be where I am without my friends, my author friends.
Oh, I know. I feel like if you're creating anything, you need that community of people that's doing
Yes.
the work.
Yes.
Otherwise, it can feel so lonely, and it can sometimes feel like you forget that people are going through the same challenges. You forget that when you're
Yes.
sitting down to create, other people are challenged the same way, or you put something out into the world and it doesn't have the impact that you thought it would have. And you got to
Mm-hmm.
talk those things out. And then also, I was on the phone with a friend of mine the other day, and probably similar to your group, when I got off the phone, I felt so pumped and jazzed, and I was like
Yes.
ready to go and get back at it, even though some of the things that I was working on just wasn't quite working out. So we need those people in our lives. Like, that's part of the creative process.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, writing is a pretty solitary, career. And so it can feel, especially someone like me, and I live in a pretty small town Pennsylvania. It's not like I have this robust writing community that I can go grab a coffee with another writer, all the time. Whereas people that live in bigger cities, they have more things like that. And so finding people online and really connecting and forming these close relationships has been so, so important for me.
How do you become a better writer? With your work, every book, I would assume, like every book, you're obviously gaining new skills, you're seeing things
Mhm.
differently, you're continuing to learn how to become better in your writing. So how do you look at getting better in your work?
I think you just nailed it. I think it's just doing it. It's the more you write, the better you get, the more you read. I think reading is critical for being a writer, because you are just seeing what other people are doing, you're finding inspiration, all that sort of stuff. Yes, there's craft books, and I love a good craft book, and those are great. Going to webinars, listening to speakers, all that kind of stuff is super valuable. It's not going to replace just sitting down, getting your butt in the chair and doing the actual writing. I've certainly improved with each book, I think. I just feel like each one is a little bit stronger than the last. And one thing that's tricky, I think, because I think a lot of writers can tend to be maybe perfectionists, is you look back on your early stuff and almost like cringe, because it's like, oh, I'm so much better now or whatever. But that's who I was in that moment. And I was proud of that work then. And I'm proud of that work now. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just, of course, you grow in any career, in any skill, you get better the more you do it. So it's just part of the process.
Yeah. When you wrote your first book, did you have in mind, I'm writing this book and it's going to get published? Or was it more of I just want to write this book? Like, what was your thought process?
It was very much sort of a family project. It started out like that. My first book is a fictionalized biography of a relative. So it's historical fiction. And I thought I was just going to put it out for my family and friends. And in large part, that is what happened. And that was perfect for that particular project, for that particular book. I didn't know what I was doing in terms of self-publishing. I plopped it up on Amazon and, didn't know anything about marketing or anything. And so along the way, I've of course learned. And then I self-published 2 books subsequently following that, much more professionally and, with a lot more knowledge base behind it. But yes, the first book, I didn't know at that time that it would turn into what it is now, or what this career and this journey has become. But it holds a special place in my heart for sure. Just kind of like little Jen, not really knowing what she was doing, but just knowing that I loved the story and loved to write, and my family loved it, so it was great.
What are your biggest challenges now you're a full-time writer. What are some of the challenges that you're facing around any part of the career? Is it the writing? Is it finding publishers? Is it editing? What do you feel like is your biggest challenge?
Whew, I would say just whether it's me or any writer, it's kind of like finding the right path for you. There's so many different avenues now for publishing, whether deciding if you wanted to go traditional, if you want to go self-published, if you want to try to go hybrid. I mean, there's so many different ways to do it now. And I still am dabbling in a lot of different spaces. So yes, I have self-published. I'll probably self-publish again in the future. I am with a publisher now, and that's going great as well. And I still have more on my contract to fulfill with them. But at the same time, I also have a manuscript that's in the query trenches. So I'm still like toying with the idea of securing an agent, trying to get more like a broader distribution into bookstores. So it's just kind of like trying to keep climbing that ladder, I would say, and get more readership and get your name out there. But it takes a while. The stories that you hear of the debut author who is picked up by the celebrity book clubs and who's all over, the New York Times and all of that, those are really, really small, like amazing success stories. But the likelihood is very small. So they say on average, it takes 8 books to kind of get your name out there, to get that readership and so forth. So I just had number 6 come out. So I do grow a little bit with each book. And that's kind of where my focus is. I'm trying not to compare to other people. I'm trying not to jump too far ahead. Slow and steady wins the race.
How do you do that? The comparison, I feel like comparison, imposter syndrome, and perfectionism show up all the time
like the
in
trifecta.
the creative process. So how do you do that? How do you not pay attention to somebody else's work, or somebody that, especially if you're like, my book's better than that book?
I know. Listen, I totally get that. And it's tough. I've read books that, were a Reese's Book Club pick or this or that or whatever. And I've read them and thought, really? Okay, like I didn't think it was that great, and but again, I remind myself reading is totally subjective. So just because I didn't love it doesn't mean other people won't love it. Totally fair. I also just sometimes need to take social media breaks if it's feeling too much, if it's like overwhelming, or if I find myself feeling those feelings that are yucky, or you're just like, it's like, okay, no, need to step back, focus on yourself, and, stay present in the moment. But generally speaking, I am just so happy for other people's success when I see it, because I feel like one woman's success is all of ours, and one author's success is all of ours. It just is showing that the opportunities are there and the possibilities are there. So I try to keep that mindset of I'm very happy with where I am now. My books are selling. I'm in a great place. And so, I think baby steps are good.
Yes. Yes. What are you most proud of as a writer today?
I am proud that my work has resonated with people. I've gotten lots of really sweet messages. Of course, it's great to hear from readers just saying like, "Oh, I loved your book," or "Oh, I stayed up too late, like reading, into the night." And those are wonderful to hear. But it's sometimes is the really personal messages that I get. For instance, the book that I mentioned earlier, where the woman who can't carry a child, and it's because of a medical condition. And I had a reader email me and say, I have this condition in real life and I've never seen it in a book. I've never read about anything. Like I've never, it's never. And so she was like, thank you so much for talking about this. And of course, to me, it was like a mind blowing moment. It was never my intention to sort of really highlight that wasn't the main purpose of the book, but it reached her, it touched her, and she related. And so I just loved that. It just meant so much to me. So I'm proud that my stories are reaching people in, kind of special ways. And whether it's serving as entertainment or it means something more, it's great.
Oh, wow, that's so cool. That must be so awesome to get those types of messages and emails. Your books feel very like they should be turned into a movie. Is that a dream of yours?
I think it's every writer's big dream. I think if you would have asked most authors, a decade or two ago, most people would have said like, "Oh, I want to reach the New York Times bestsellers list," which is still an amazing accomplishment and a huge dream. But now a lot of writers are like all about the film adaptation. So whether it's a movie, a TV show, like that's just huge. That would be incredible. And yes, my books do sort of lean towards that Lifetime movie situation where it's very drama. It's very, like the baby that goes missing, the baby shows up on the doorstep, like, the cheating husband. So yeah, all that kind of fun stuff is ripe for fiction, and it makes a good film. So my publisher has toyed and they've put out some options for film, but nothing's like kind of snagged yet. So we'll see. I mean, that would be incredible.
Oh my gosh. Which one of your books? Okay, of the 6 books that you have out now, which one would you choose to be turned into a movie if you could?
Oh gosh. I could see them all. I think my most recent that just came out yesterday, The Day She Vanished, would be great because it from the first chapter, so the very first scene, there's drama and tension, and a little girl goes missing from an amusement park. So it's sort of every mother's worst nightmare. And then the book follows the family and the mom as they are searching for this child. And you're just sort of on the edge of your seat, like, what's going to happen? Are they going to find her? And then, but really, it's more than just the search. It's the whole breakdown of the family and the interpersonal relationships between husband and wife and mother and children and all of that. So
Do you write the description for the books for
like the back
Amazon?
covers.
Yeah, for the covers, for the promotion.
So my self-published books, I do all of that myself. I'm sort of like a one-man band and in charge of everything. When you sign with a publisher, usually the author then does lose a bit of that creative control. And so in my experience, my publisher does the cover design, the title, the cover copy, all of the marketing sort of stuff. So they're in charge of that, but they're the experts and they know what's going to really grab the reader and what's going to sell. So I put my trust in them, and so far it's been great.
I ask because that I feel like that can be so challenging when you've written the book and you're like, okay, now I have to try to condense this small
Oh
little
my
idea
gosh.
of to get people excited about reading the book. And okay, so I just have to read because when you write fiction, it's all about story.
It's
Like
yeah.
you have to have a good story. And
Yep.
so you find the hook and you have this story. So I just have to read this because for the listeners, because if you're curious, oh, what is this? The Day She Vanished, and maybe I
Yeah.
should read it. This is the little blurb. It will be quick. They'll be fine. These are the words Greta tells herself as she leaves her 3 kids waiting at the table while she and Wade, her husband, ride the big roller coaster. She needs this moment, needs to reclaim a small piece of herself outside of motherhood. But when the coaster rolls to a stop and she searches for the kids through the crowd, panic sets in. Summer, the youngest, is not there. In an instant, Greta is thrust into every parent's worst nightmare. Why did she think she could leave her children alone even for a minute? What kind of mother is she? What? Yes,
Mhm.
please. I want to
Mhm.
know.
Yeah, I think especially as a mom myself, I love tapping into like the motherhood, side of all my stories. Most of them have some sort of like that component of whether it's like a young children or older children, but it's what I live and breathe daily. So I'm constantly put in those situations of like, the mom guilt for this or that, or what would you do? Or that yearning for just like, oh, that piece of yourself, outside of motherhood. And so a lot of my books talk about that kind of thing.
Well, it's very grabbing. It's very
Thank you.
attention grabbing.
Yes. And like I said, that is chapter 1. So you will not have to read much to really get into the story.
Oh my gosh. See, that's why I feel like it's a movie. Like this is
Mhm.
I see this, it's a Netflix movie. We can cast it. We can just we need to get
Well,
it
from
going.
your lips to the producer's ears, let it out into the universe, Hollywood. We're
Let's
ready for you.
make let's make it happen.
That's right.
I sometimes think about this gap between kind of this idea of the work that we want to create. We have this idea in mind and what it looks like, feels like, sounds like, and then kind of where we are today. And sometimes there's this gap. I mean, my listeners have heard me talk about this before. Ira Glass talks about it's this taste gap. It's like we have good taste in creating, but sometimes we don't yet have the skill set to create that work. And so there's this gap that we have to go from like where we are today to where we want to be in the future. You've written 6 books, you've gotten better at each one. What advice would you give to someone to kind of help them through the gap, because they're really trying hard to create great work, but what they're creating isn't what they know they're capable of yet?
Hmm. I think it goes back to just the doing. I think you're gonna have to sometimes you have to start out not great at something to get better at it. So whether that's just like putting in more hours or practice or just doing whatever that creative thing is, putting in the time, I think that's the only way to really improve whatever you're doing. But also taking inspiration, like really being aware of what's happening in your particular industry or in your little niche that, what are other creatives doing, and not from the standpoint of copying, because we don't want to like plagiarize. We don't want to, try to be someone we're not. But sometimes like learning from others can give you a lot of inspiration and really fill back up that creative bucket if you're feeling kind of drained or uninspired. So I think those are definitely 2 of my biggest tips.
You said reading is obviously important for writing. So reading and
Hmm.
talking to other people, and you're getting other influences. And so it's not stealing, you're just using, you're able to use what other people are doing and kind of make it your own, which
Yeah,
is
totally.
all of art.
Yes.
So craft books, I know I don't want to get into too much of them, but is there 1 or 2 that you feel like would be good for someone who is trying to become a better writer?
Yes, absolutely. Donald Mass has a book that I really admire. He has great resources. I also really like Tiffany Yates Martin from her editing standpoint. So I think her book is intuitive editing. And so when I was doing my self published books, that was really great to read as a resource to know how to kind of do a lot of my own self editing before I went out and needed a professional and things like that. I use Save the Cat as a plotting device, and Save the Cat by Jessica Brody, I believe, is great for if you want to just kind of learn the structure of how to kind of break down a novel and where those beats need to be in the plot. So that one's really helpful. Let's see, I could go on and on. There's lots of inspirational books like Bird for Bird. What's the Elizabeth Gilbert has one. I think that's Creative
Is it
Magic.
Big Magic?
Yes.
Big Magic is one of my favorite books. It is so good. It's one of those books, Jen, I was going to actually ask you this question, but to me, when like, I wish I wrote that book. Like, that's the
Don't
book
we
I
all?
wish I wrote. What book do you wish you wrote?
Oh my gosh. Well, that's like almost an impossible question.
I know.
I don't even know if I could answer that because I could tell you my favorite book of all time is Little Women. Not that I would ever say like I wish I wrote it, because I would never want to take that away from Louisa May Alcott, who is like a
Oh my
classic.
gosh, of course not.
But I am inspired by a lot of sister stories. I never had a sister myself growing up. And so I love reading about sisters, which is probably one of my big draws to Little Women. But I did read last year Ann Napolitano's Hello, Beautiful. And that pays homage to Little Women in like a modern sort of take. And so anytime I read something that, really touches me and feels like it relates back to kind of like my early loves of reading, I'm always like, oh, I wish I would have written that. But then in the same breath, it's like, no, that's their book baby, and that was their creation, and it's not a jealousy thing. It's just it's an inspired thing. It's like, oh, I'm
Yes.
so inspired by these authors. Definitely.
That's how I approach the question. Of course, I don't mean it
Yeah.
because, their work is so beautiful, but there are certain authors that I will read, and I'm just so in awe of how they
Yes.
write and how their mind works. But that goes
Mhm.
back to the influence, right? Like
Mhm.
it can influence our work in really beautiful ways. And so it almost
Mhm.
just inspires me to kind of continue to read their work and then also just find other people's work because everyone, I mean, you think about how many people are writing books and putting them out in the world, or even just writing blogs and articles and ideas and sharing them. And there's so many different ideas and some that really resonate with people and some that don't. And just I'm fascinated by why that is. What do you feel like makes for really great writing?
Well, I think just everyone has a different style, and some if you read an author repeatedly, like the same author, like you'll pick up on their style, and you'll hear people say like, "Oh, that's such a Joe Blow book or whatever," because it's so distinct. And so I think just like the writing style does play into it a lot. So whether that's like really lyrical and poetic or the ability to just like create that tension on the page, I think the tension is really important. That's what keeps the story moving. But just like the storytelling, just, something that touches you, that you can relate to, but also keeps you entertained and wants you to keep going. It's like almost impossible to put your finger on it. Like what makes great writing? It's such a multitude of things, but when you read it, it, sort of thing.
Yes. Oh my gosh, it's so true. I feel like there's such this essence when you're reading a book and you just get into it for some reason, which I find interesting when people talk about some books that were massively popular, but then writers will talk about how the writing actually sucks. It's
Yes.
just a good story.
The one that comes to mind a lot and that gets kind of like dragged through the mud is like the Twilight series.
Yes.
Um, Obviously, like commercially huge success, right? And was made into movies and whatever. And like, sure, the story's like fascinating with the vampires and the love story and all of that. But this is not me saying it, but a lot of writers do say like the quality of the writing is not great. It's not some amazingly written novel, but it's sure as hell entertaining. And so same
Yep.
thing with like the 50 Shades of Grey books
I was
and
just going to say that one. Those are the two that come up every time a writer will mention that story. It needs to have
yeah,
a compelling story, and the writing can be horrible, and you'll still be able to have success with it.
exactly. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's so interesting. All right. So, Jen, what are you most excited about over the next 5 years? Where do you see yourself? What do you want to be doing? How many books do you want to have written?
Well, I'm sort of on track to be putting out 2 books a year. That's what I've been doing. That's what my publishers kind of like set me up for. So I'm looking for, I've got 2 new stories coming out in 2025, which is going to be great. And I would love to stay on that trajectory. I would love to just kind of like increase my readership and see where it takes me. Like I said, I do have one manuscript that I'm hoping to maybe secure an agent with. And so that's kind of a goal of mine. If it doesn't happen, pivot, you kind of like, all right, readjust, refocus, go a different direction. So I'm just kind of trying to stay. I do love like looking out ahead, but also trying to stay a little bit closer.
Yes. Well, it was so fun to chat with you. I always ask all of my guests at the end of the episode, what is one activity that the listeners can try in 10 minutes or less to help them live a more creative life?
Go for a walk. Get outside, get out in nature, walk. Sometimes walking is where I get my best ideas. It's where I can brainstorm. It's where I can forget other things and just focus. And so I am very much a big proponent for walking. Go for a walk.
I love it. Oh my gosh. I know. My walks are just like my sanctuary. I feel like every morning I take a walk after my workout and that's where the ideas happen.
Yep.
You have to make sure you have your little notes app, or I just bought these, maybe I have them. I just bought these little notebooks too that I like bring with me everywhere that I
Yeah.
just put in my purse.
I mean,
So many.
absolutely. The Notes app is I can't live without.
I know. I know. This year I have just there I put everything in there.
Mhm.
Because, it's like those ideas where you're like, this idea is so good, I'm not going to forget it. And then an hour later, you're like, what the heck was I thinking? I don't know what I don't remember that idea at all.
Oh, totally.
All right, Jen, you're awesome. I'm so happy to have met you. We actually met on Threads and randomly, and I was like, oh my gosh, Jen, your work is so great. We need to have you on the show. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I appreciate it. And congratulations on the new book and all of your success. And hey, I'm telling you, you're gonna turn one of these into a movie, and I'm here for it.
I would love it. I would love it so much. Thank you for having me. This was so fun. And yeah, everyone can check out the new book, The Day She Vanished. It's out now.
I hope you enjoyed this episode and found some inspiration. And if you are interested in supporting Jen, go check out her latest book, The Day She Vanished. I will put the link in the description for you to check out. Thank you so much for listening. I so appreciate you. And if you love this podcast and want to support it, please go over to iTunes and give it a rating and a review. It really does help people find the show, and I would so greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, go create something.